You've probably heard the old adage, there's 3 things you don't talk about at the dinner table: money, politics, and religion. This is because of the strong passion and opinions evoked by these topics. And where there's a passionate opinion, there's often an argument waiting around the corner. Now, here's something to consider in regard to the third topic, religion.
Hey, I thought we weren't going to talk about religion.
To what extent should religion be considered an opinion?
Are you ignoring me? We said no religion at the table.
The topic of religion falls under the category of conversations of faith.
Wait, so we can talk about our faith at the table, but not religion?
Faith conversations concern God. Formally, when talking about faith and God, we call this theology.
So we can talk about theology at the dinner table. Got it.
Why don't you just wait till the end to chime in anymore, okay?
Sorry, just have some religion stuff I'd really like to talk about at the table. And politics. And I need some money. A lot of money.
So, back to the question. Is theology, is your faith in God, an opinion, or is it a confession? Well, the answer is found in how you approach the topic of theology. Typically, speaking about God, that is to say, doing theology, happens in one of 2 basic forms. One approach can be called theodicy. A second approach is called theophany. We'll talk more about these 2 approaches to theology and how they play out in Christian conversation. But before we do, I want to talk about another important part of faith conversations, the words we use and the way we define those words. If you've had a conversation with a fellow Christian, sometimes you're both using the same words, but you mean something very different.
Can you pass me the butter so I can put it on my hands?
Excuse me?
The butter. It goes on my hands. What do you do with butter?
As I was saying, sometimes you both use the same words, but mean something very different. Words like faith, gospel, and sin.
And butter.
All words that seem like they should be understood in the same way, but scratch just below the surface, and you'll find there are a lot of different ways people define those words, and most every other faith word.
Now I can't talk about butter at the dinner table?
Excuse me. Sorry, maybe we can have some privacy here. We'll talk more in upcoming episodes about some of those different faith definitions, but for now, we can simply say that those differences are generally found in the different, well, we'll call them backpacks we all bring into these conversations, the different assumptions we make without even thinking about it in most cases. Most people carry around an ancient Greek philosopher named Aristotle in their backpack. Aristotle was the founder of an approach to understanding things that's rooted in asking questions starting with what? And to answer that question, you need to focus on putting things into categories, defining things. And then, in the case of Scripture, you look for meaning. This is an approach we'll refer to as ad modum Aristotelis, which means in the mode of Aristotle, using Aristotle's approach of definitions, categories, and finding meaning. This is the typical default way of thinking for modern thinkers like you and me. And technically, this modern way of thinking is really coming out of a philosopher named Kant, as much as it is Aristotle. This Western philosophical approach is rooted in ancient Greek philosophy and the assumption that to be skeptical is to be wise. In other words, the wisest people are those whose wisdom comes from asking skeptical questions such as why, what, how, and finally saying, prove it. These are very helpful questions to ask when dealing with most parts of our lives. But when doing theology in this way, asking skeptical questions, it's called theodicy, asking the big questions. The other way people approach theology is by sticking with Scripture itself, or ad modum scripturae, in the mode of Scripture. In this approach, the foundational questions are not Instead, the foundational question we ask is, who? In other words, the assumption is that God speaks to and about his people in the Scriptures. And that means the Scriptures are a confession of God's speaking to and acting upon people. Doing theology in this manner is called theophany, which means the revelation of God. The distinction between the theodicy of philosophy, asking the big questions, and the theophany of Scripture, recognizing God speaks and acts on his people through Scripture, is an important thing to keep in mind, especially when it comes to studying Martin Luther. Certainly, Luther was well-versed in Western philosophical assumptions and approaches. He was very, very good at using these approaches, actually. But when it came to thinking theologically, he recognized that's not the way God is working in the Scriptures. And that recognition was and is absolutely critical. When engaging in faith conversations, theological conversations, the foundational approach and assumptions are critical for where the conversation will lead and the conclusions that are reached. When working in the mode of Aristotle, ad modum Aristotelis, theology, conversations about faith, will be rooted in speculation and skepticism, leading to further questions, wonderment, and doubt. By contrast, when theological, faith conversations are in the mode of Scripture, ad modum scripturae, the conversation will revolve around God's speaking to his people. When faith and theology are rooted in God's own words, the end product is assertions, faith, and assurance. Scripture itself illustrates this distinction. In the discipline of theology, ad modum Aristotelis is the approach found in the devil's deception in the Garden of Eden. The first words out of Satan's mouth are a skeptical question. Did God really say? Whereas the voice of God makes faith, as testified to by the Apostle Paul. Faith comes through hearing the gospel, the promise of God, spoken to you. So, as you continue to engage these topics, theology, faith, definitions, keep these distinctions in mind and ask yourself these questions. Are you relying on Aristotle and the questions philosophy brings to Scripture? Or are you letting Scripture speak for itself, telling you who God is and who you are in relation to God?